I'm Markus Daechsel, and I'm a reader in history, and I specialize in the history of Muslim societies in the history department. I think most people would agree that international aid, the transfer of resources, of expertise to countries of the global south from the rich north, occupies a really important part in how people in the global north think about themselves. The last Labour government, for example, took great pains to make sure that Africa remained very high on its agenda, the granting of aid to Africa, helping Africa to its feet, not just alleviating humanitarian catastrophes, but also leading genuine change in the continent. And likewise, until today, a lot of people in the British public care very deeply about this mission to help the rest of the world. At the same time, of course, there are also critical voices who are becoming quite powerful actually in recent years. So sections of the Conservative Party, for example, are convinced that trade is better than aid, that the direct transfer of resources only leads to corruption and doesn't really achieve a great deal of political aims. Part of my own research has been to look at this question from a historical perspective, because it's important to remember that international aid has its own history, which is actually not as long as one would think. It only dates back to about the 1950s, or at best to the period after the Second World War. It's important to remember that the idea that the global north should come to the aid of the global south was not something that was particularly widely endorsed before that. After World War I, there were some isolated attempts at international humanitarianism, particularly helping people in what was then the decaying Ottoman Empire in the aftermath of World War I. International aid had some sort of a prehistory in the work of some private philanthropists who started to get concerned about human catastrophes in parts of the global south around the time of the First World War. So, for example, the transfer of population after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire between Greece and Turkey was an early site where international involvement could take place. And there were also a few people who wanted to pursue that more seriously under the guise of the League of Nations. However, for most part of the world at that period, there was no commitment to the systematic transfer of resources from the global north to the poor south. In fact, the guiding principle was quite the opposite. We were living in a situation of colonial rule, where most parts of the global south were under direct control of colonial powers in Europe. And underpinning the colonial relationship very often was the idea that no resources from the mother country should be spent in the colonies themselves. So, for example, when the British ruled over India, one of the stated policy requirements of ruling India was that ruling India should not cost the British taxpayer any money at all. So any money that was required in order to, let's say, build railways, educational institutions, or other facilities in India had to be raised locally, had to be raised from the population of India itself. And that, of course, imposed very strict limits on how much could be done in terms of development work under colonial tutelage, because colonial governments always tried to do things on the cheap, because they didn't want to raise taxes beyond what they could actually politically support, because raising taxes in such a context would always mean that locals would get annoyed and then launch resistance against you. So in order to keep resistance down, the colonial state often preferred to keep taxes low, but also to do very little in terms of governance for the people they controlled. So the big question is, why was there such a big change in attitudes after the Second World War? And the easy one-word or two-word answer to this is the onset of the Cold War. It was the context of an international relationship of competition between the Western bloc, led by the United States of America, and the Soviet Union, which became the main driving force to rethink transfers from the rich north to the global south. But even that didn't happen overnight. There are some early statements by American presidents, for example, Truman in 1948 when he was re-elected for his second term, which made international assistance one of his policy goals. But for many years after World War II, there was very little money put where people's mouth was. So in other words, it was more of a rhetorical commitment than an actual commitment of resources. And international aid really only hits its stride in the late 1950s and in the 1960s. And there's a couple of interesting reasons to consider here why this shift actually took place. In the early years, in the late 1940s and in the early 1950s, most American policymakers and also Soviet policymakers believed that the Cold War was still primarily a military conflict. So they were willing to reward countries who would side with the respective of the two blocs. So if a country signed up to enter an alliance with the United States of America, for example, or an alliance with other NATO countries, they would receive generous military aid. The idea that you should give international aid for development purposes to actually finance very ambitious projects to change societies and make lives better for the people living in the global south only comes in the late 1950s when thinking about international relations also undergoes a fairly substantive change. And what's really important in this instance is the impact of a group of scholars who came up with a new theoretical vision of the world called modernization theory. And what they in a sense argued was that rapid change, economic and social and political change, was happening around the world in parts of the global south as much as in parts of the global north. That rapid change was always a very dangerous situation politically because change could also lead to chaos, it could lead to whole sections of society being impoverished, it could lead to anarchy, it could lead to the breakdown of governments, which in their view would also present an opportunity to international radicals, particularly communists at that time, to take over. So they managed to persuade the American policy establishment, particularly the Kennedy administration, that it was wiser to pay large amounts of money in international aid transfers to governments of the global south in order to smoothen that change that was happening anyway. And the really interesting or important point about this was that they advocated the giving of aid even to governments that were not actually very pro-American to begin with. So in the past, aid would only be given to those who were willing to fight at the side of the Americans, for example in Korea, who were interested in military alliances. But now modernization theory, this new approach, said that it didn't really matter where a particular government stood politically as long as they were not communist. So even politicians like Nasser in Egypt, who would castigate the Americans on a daily basis in his speeches, or Nehru in India, who made a big point about not signing up to alliances with America, would now receive very large amounts of aid. Why? Because the Americans understood that if those governments would no longer remain in charge of social change in their own countries and could steer social change in such a way that a communist takeover would be prevented, then that the Cold War game itself would be lost. And that's actually the point at which very large transfers of resources begin to happen, billions of dollars being paid for 5-year plans, for example, in India or in Egypt. And one perhaps less savory or geopolitical aspect to the expansion of international aid was also pure economic interest in the donor countries. We have to remember that by the 1950s and 60s, rebuilding Europe after the Second World War, which had filled the order books of most companies, both in Europe itself, but also in the United States. And of course, we also have another aspect in the Far East here, so Japan, Korea, very similar situation. Now, all of this rebuilding had been done by that time, and companies were actually looking for new frontiers, new markets, new places where they could invest. And the rapid expansion of global development efforts offered a perfect opportunity to do that. So alongside billions of dollars that would be paid to a government, let's say, like Nehru's in India for their first and second 5-year plans, would also come contracts for Western companies. So for example, the German steel industry got a contract to build one of India's biggest steel mills at the time, and similar contracts would also go to American, French, Swiss, Italian, you name it, a company. So there was an economic aspect to this as well. But the big switch happened when American foreign policymakers began to understand that international aid could be used as a foreign policy tool even if the aid wasn't tied to any particular treaty commitments. So giving aid to countries who were not closely aligned to you could still benefit your interests because it would ensure that social change in those countries would run more smoothly, could be got under control by local governments, and hence you could minimize a communist takeover. And of course, there was very similar thinking also happening on the other side. And some countries actually were very good at playing the two sides out against each other. The best example here is perhaps President Nasser in Egypt, who managed to get Soviet aid to build the Aswan Dam, one of the biggest construction projects of the post-war period anywhere in the world, damming the river Nile, so a huge project, and also get military aid from the Soviet Union directly, and at the same time get food aid and grain from the United States. And he simply did that by playing the two sides out against each other, not committing to either, but if not getting from one side what he wanted, simply going to the other and said, well, if you don't give me what we want, I can always go to the other camp, which gave him a lot of maneuver. And there were other governments who played the very same game in that particular period between the late 1950s and the 1960s.